The night my sister left her baby on my doorstep, the wind was howling like it knew something the rest of us didn't. I was 42 then, already feeling older than my years, my bones aching the way they do when a storm is coming. I remember standing in my thin nightgown, barefoot on the cold wood of the porch, staring down at that small bundle as if it might vanish if I blinked. He was wrapped in a faded blue blanket I recognized immediately. It had been ours, from childhood, stitched by our mother before she died. That was how I knew, before my mind could catch up, that this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't some lost child. This was my sister's doing. There was no note, no explanation, just the sound of a car engine fading into the dark, and the soft, fragile breathing of a baby who had no idea his entire life had just been rearranged. I brought him inside and held him against my chest, his tiny fingers curling around the fabric of my gown. He smelled like milk and something sweet and unfamiliar, like a future I had never planned for. I told myself she'd come back by morning. My sister was many things, reckless, selfish, charming when it suited her, but I couldn't imagine her disappearing forever. Morning came, then the next, then weeks. I named him Daniel because he needed a name, and because saying the baby felt cruel. Every time I said his name out loud, it rooted him a little deeper into my life. I fed him, rocked him through colic-filled nights, learned the language of his cries the way only a mother, or someone who becomes one overnight, can. And every night, after he finally slept, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea and stared at the door, waiting for my sister to walk back through it with an apology on her lips. She never did. People in town whispered, of course. Small towns always do. They asked where Daniel's mother was, and I told them the truth in pieces. Family trouble. She's not well. I'm just helping for now. The lie I told most often was to myself, that this was temporary. But years have a way of hardening temporary things into permanence. Daniel grew like sunflowers do, fast and toward the light. He called me auntie at first, then mama by accident, and eventually just mom, without any ceremony at all. The first time he did it, I corrected him gently, my voice tight. The second time I let it slide. By the third, it felt like the truth, even if it wasn't written down anywhere official. I never told him the full story. How could I? How do you explain to a child that the woman who gave him life chose not to raise him? I told him she loved him, that she had problems, that she couldn't take care of him the way she wanted to. Those words tasted like rust in my mouth, but I swallowed them anyway. There were letters at first, one every few months, always with no return address. My sister's handwriting was the same, sharp and slanted, impatient even on paper. She never asked to see him, never asked for pictures. She wrote about herself, about the places she'd been, the men she'd loved and left, the jobs she quit. At the end, she always wrote the same line. Thank you for taking care of him. That was all. As if Daniel were a borrowed coat she'd asked me to hold on to. Then the letters stopped. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful. I worked at the library, a quiet job for a woman who had learned to keep her emotions carefully shelved. Daniel did his homework at the dining table while I cooked. On Sundays, we went to church, and he sang too loudly and off-key, and I smiled every time. He had my laugh, people said, my patience, my stubborn streak. I nodded and accepted the compliments, even though somewhere deep inside, a small voice reminded me that his blood was not mine. Still, he was my son in every way that mattered. When Daniel turned 18, he asked about his mother for the first time in a way that frightened me. Not the casual curiosity of a child, but the sharp, searching question of a young man trying to understand himself. We sat on the back steps at dusk, the sky bruised purple and gold, and he asked me why she never came back. I didn't know what to say. So I told him what I believed then, that she wasn't capable of being what he needed, and that sometimes love looks like walking away. He nodded, but I could tell it didn't settle inside him the way I'd hoped. He left for college, then for work, and the house grew quiet again. Too quiet. I filled the silence with memories and routines, with the comforting lie that everything important had already happened. I told myself the past was finished with us. I was wrong. 40 years after that stormy night, when my hair had gone white and my hands trembled when I poured my tea, there was a knock at my door that felt heavier than all the others combined. I knew who it was before I opened it. My heart knew. The air knew. My sister stood there, older, thinner, her beauty dulled but still sharp in places like broken glass. Her eyes went past me, straight into the house, as if she were already counting what she believed was hers. "I'm here for my son," she said. And in that moment, every lie I had ever told myself cracked wide open. I don't remember inviting her inside, but somehow she was suddenly sitting at my kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she hadn't asked for. She looked around like she was inspecting a museum exhibit. My curtains, my framed photos, the faint smell of lemon cleaner in old books. Her eyes lingered on the pictures of Daniel at every age: missing teeth, graduation cap, wedding day. Each photo was a quiet accusation. "You did well," she said finally, her voice flat. Not gratitude, not warmth, an assessment. I stood by the sink because my knees felt unreliable. 40 years collapsed into that small room, pressing against my ribs until it hurt to breathe. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times in the early years: her return, her apology, her tears. What I hadn't imagined was this calm certainty she carried, like she was collecting something she'd left behind at a train station. "You don't get to come back and say that," I told her. My voice surprised me. It was steadier than I felt. She sighed, the same dramatic sigh she used as a girl whenever things didn't go her way. "I didn't have a choice back then, you know that." I almost laughed. The sound clawed its way up my throat and died there. "We all have choices," I said. "You chose to leave him on my doorstep." Her eyes finally met mine, and for a moment I saw something flicker. Regret, maybe, or irritation that I hadn't folded the way she expected. "I was young. I was scared. You were stable, responsible. I knew you'd do the right thing." The right thing. As if raising her child had been some civic duty, not a life-altering sacrifice. I wanted to scream about the nights I cried myself to sleep, the opportunities I let go of, the relationships that never happened because I was already full of responsibility, of love, of fear. But the words tangled inside me, heavy and useless. "Daniel doesn't know you," I said instead. "Not really." "He's my blood," she replied, sharp as a blade. "And I want to reconnect before it's too late." There it was. Not love, not longing, fear of time running out, fear of dying without reclaiming what she believed was hers. I told her Daniel lived out of town now, that he had a family of his own, a job that kept him busy. All true. I didn't tell her that he called me every Sunday, that he still asked for my advice, that he still signed his cards, "Love, your son." That felt sacred, private. She stayed for 2 days. 2 unbearable days where her presence sucked the air from every room. She asked questions about Daniel's childhood, his preferences, his habits, as if memorizing facts would make her a mother retroactively. I answered what I could, dodging what I couldn't bear to give away. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle, my mind replaying every moment of the past 4 decades. I wondered if I had stolen something from her. If love, once given, could ever truly belong to just one person. The guilt crept in quietly, insidiously, whispering doubts I had buried long ago. On the third morning, she announced she was going to call him. I felt something cold slide down my spine. "You can't just—" "He deserves to know I'm here," she interrupted. "He deserves the truth." The truth. Another word she used like a shield. She made the call from the living room, her back straight, her voice suddenly soft and trembling in a way that felt rehearsed. I stood in the hallway, close enough to hear only fragments. His name. Long pauses. a sharp intake of breath that might have been tears or triumph. When she hung up, she turned to me with a smile that made my stomach twist. "He wants to see me." I nodded, because my body didn't remember how to do anything else. Inside, something ancient and fragile cracked open. Fear, raw and unfiltered. Not that he would leave me, but that the story I had built our lives on was about to be rewritten without my consent. Daniel arrived that evening. He looked older than the boy I remembered dropping off at college, lines around his eyes, a gravity that comes from living a full life. When he saw my sister, he froze. The room held its breath. She stood, tears finally spilling, reaching for him. "My baby," she whispered. He didn't hug her. He didn't pull away, either. He just stood there, caught between past and present, between blood and bond. I watched his face shift through confusion, curiosity, something like hope. Each expression felt like a small loss. We talked for hours. Stories were exchanged, explanations offered, apologies half-formed and carefully worded. My sister cried openly now, her voice breaking as she spoke about mistakes, about survival, about love she claimed had always been there, even from afar. I said very little. That night, after she went to bed, Daniel sat with me at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once fed him mashed bananas, where I'd helped him with homework, where I'd waited for a sister who never came back. He reached for my hand, his grip warm and familiar. "You're still my mom," he said quietly. "Nothing changes that." I smiled, because that's what mothers do when they don't want their children to see them breaking. But deep down, I felt the shift. A tremor. Because even if love doesn't divide, it does stretch. And I wasn't sure how much more I could bear before something tore. And still, I hadn't the slightest idea what my sister was truly here for. Not yet. The next morning, I woke before the sun, the way I always do now, my body trained by decades of routine and worry. The house felt different with her in it, heavier, like the walls were listening. I made coffee and sat at the table alone, my fingers wrapped around the mug, watching steam rise and disappear. I thought of all the mornings I'd sat right there with Daniel as a boy, cutting his toast into neat squares, reminding him to tie his shoes, pretending not to notice when he slipped his hand into mine because the world felt too big. I had lived an entire lifetime in that space, and now she was upstairs, sleeping in the guest room, breathing easily, as if she hadn't detonated a quiet bomb in the middle of my old age. When she came down, she was dressed carefully, hair brushed, lipstick applied. She looked like a woman preparing for something important, an interview, a performance. "We're going to have lunch," she said, pouring herself coffee without asking. "Daniel and I." My chest tightened. "Just the two of you?" She glanced at me, something like impatience flashing across her face. "We need time, alone. You've had 40 years. That sentence landed like a slap. I felt heat rush to my face, followed by a hollow ache. 40 years, as if those years were a possession I'd hoarded, not a life I'd given. I didn't argue. I didn't trust myself to. They left together late morning. I watched from the window as Daniel opened the car door for her, polite, distant. He smiled, but it was the careful smile he uses with strangers. I clung to that detail like a lifeline. The hours crawled. I tried to read but couldn't focus, tried to clean but kept finding myself standing still, lost in memories. I wondered what she was telling him now, without me there to soften the edges or correct the lies. I wondered how easy it was for her to rewrite history when I was no longer in the room. By the time they returned, the sky had begun to darken. Daniel looked exhausted. She looked satisfied. That night, she made her move. We were sitting in the living room, the three of us, the television murmuring quietly in the background. She cleared her throat and folded her hands in her lap, a posture of false humility I recognized immediately. "There's something I need to discuss," she said. "Something important." Daniel straightened. I felt my heart start to pound, slow and heavy, like warning bells. "I've been thinking a lot," she continued, eyes glistening, "about lost time, about regrets, about family." I waited. My body was tense, every instinct screaming. "I want to make things right," she said, "and I don't have much time left." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" She pressed a hand to her chest. "I'm sick." The word hung in the air, enormous and unforgiving. She spoke of doctors, of diagnoses vague enough to sound frightening but unclear enough to avoid questions, of treatments she hadn't responded to, of loneliness, of fear. She cried softly, shoulders shaking, her voice breaking in all the right places. Daniel reached for her hand. I didn't. "I don't want to die without knowing my son," she said, "without being part of his life, and his children's lives." There it was, the future she wanted to insert herself into, fully formed, no cost required. Daniel looked at me then, searching my face. I gave him a small nod. Not permission, just love. "I want to spend time together," she continued. "Travel, holidays, maybe even move closer, be a family again." Again. The room felt too small. My throat burned. I realized, with a sudden clarity that frightened me, that she hadn't come back for closure. She'd come back for belonging, for security, for legacy. And I suspected, though I didn't yet have proof, that she had come back for something else too. After she went to bed, Daniel stayed behind. He rubbed his face with his hands, the way he used to when he was overwhelmed as a boy. "She says she's dying," he said quietly. I studied him, the man I had raised, the man who trusted me. "Did she show you anything? Reports? Names?" He hesitated. "No, but why would she lie about something like that?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I thought about all the times she had lied to me growing up, about where she'd been, who she'd loved, what she wanted, about the letters she'd written, full of excuses and half-truths. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "people lie because the truth wouldn't get them what they want." He looked down at the table, jaw tight. "I don't know what to do." I reached for his hand, the same way I had decades ago. "Whatever you do," I said, "do it because it feels right to you, not because you feel guilty." He squeezed my hand. "You'll always be my mother." After he left that night, I sat alone and finally let myself cry. Not loud, dramatic sobs, quiet tears that slipped down my face and soaked into my cardigan. Tears for the girl I'd been when my sister abandoned her child. Tears for the woman I'd become without ever realizing I'd been building a life on borrowed time. But grief has a way of sharpening the senses. And beneath my sorrow, something else stirred. Suspicion. The next day, while she was out resting, I did something I'd never done before. I went into her bag. I told myself I was wrong. I told myself I was betraying her privacy. But my hands moved anyway, guided by a dread that felt older than reason. What I found there would change everything, and it would force me to make the hardest decision of my life. Her bag was heavier than it looked, the leather worn soft from years of being carried from place to place, just like her. I remember my hands shaking as I opened it, the zipper sounding far too loud in the quiet house. For a moment, I almost stopped. 40 years of swallowing my instincts had trained me well, but something in my chest burned, urgent and unforgiving, and I knew that if I didn't look now, I might never forgive myself. Inside were the usual things: makeup, pills in unmarked bottles, a hairbrush with strands of graying hair tangled in it. Then I found a folder. Thick, crisp, official looking. I sat at the table and opened it. There were medical papers, yes, but not the kind she'd described. Routine checkups, blood work, notes about stress, anxiety, insomnia, no terminal diagnosis, no countdown, no mention of anything fatal. The dates were recent, very recent. My stomach dropped so suddenly I thought I might be sick. I kept going, my heart pounding louder with each page. And then I saw something that made my vision blur. Not with tears, but with rage. Legal documents, printed emails, a draft of a will. Her name was on it. Daniel's name was on it too. She had listed him as next of kin. Not me. Not the woman who had raised him. Not the mother who had sacrificed 4 decades of her life for his. Just her. And beneath that, notes, scribbled in her familiar, sharp handwriting. Reconnect. Establish relationship. Emotional bond. Update. Will later. My hands went numb. This wasn't about dying. This wasn't about love. This was about control. About rewriting history while she still could. About stepping back into a role she had abandoned, just in time to claim credit for the finished product. I sat there for a long time. The papers spread out like evidence at a crime scene. My whole life suddenly felt like a careful illusion, one I had maintained to protect a child, only to realize the threat had never truly left. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Daniel as a baby on my doorstep, his small chest rising and falling, trusting a world that had already failed him once. I wondered if I had been foolish to believe love alone could protect him forever. The next morning, she acted normal, cheerful even. She talked about breakfast plans, about the weather, about how good it felt to be home. I watched her carefully now, noticing things I had missed before. The way her stories shifted depending on who was listening, the way her tears appeared and vanished on command. She asked where Daniel was. At work, I said. He'll visit later. She nodded, satisfied. Good. I was thinking we could all sit down tonight. Talk about the future. The future. That word tasted bitter. I spent the day rehearsing conversations in my head, all of them ending badly. I could confront her, expose her lies, tear the mask from her face. But what then? Daniel was already emotionally tangled, pulled by curiosity and guilt and blood. If I attacked her too directly, would he see me as the villain? The jealous old woman afraid of being replaced? I had raised him to be kind, compassionate, fair, and now those very qualities made him vulnerable. When Daniel arrived that evening, I watched him closely. He looked tired, weighed down by thoughts he hadn't yet put into words. She greeted him with open arms, laughter too loud, affection just a little too much. I felt something inside me harden, not into cruelty, but into resolve. After dinner, she suggested a walk, just the two of them. My heart clenched, but I said nothing. I watched them leave, her hand resting possessively on his arm. The door closed behind them, and the house fell silent again. This time, I didn't cry. I waited. They returned an hour later. Daniel's face was pale, his eyes distant. She looked pleased, victorious. Later, when she went to bed, Daniel stayed behind. He paced the living room like a caged animal. She wants to move closer, he said finally. She says she wants to make up for lost time, be part of my life, my kids' lives. I took a slow breath. And how do you feel about that? He rubbed his temples. Conflicted. She keeps saying she doesn't have long, that she's trying to fix things before it's too late. I met his eyes. Daniel, I said softly, did she show you any proof? He hesitated. Again. No. Did she ask you for anything? His shoulders stiffened. She mentioned paperwork, legal things, said it would make things easier later. There it was. I reached for his hand, grounding myself in the familiar warmth of it. I need to tell you something, I said. My voice trembled despite my efforts. And you may hate me for it. He looked alarmed. What? I told him about the folder, the papers, the lies. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't editorialize. I just laid the truth on the table, raw and undeniable. When I finished, the room felt hollow. She lied? He whispered. Yes. He sank into the chair, his face crumpling in a way that broke my heart all over again. I wanted to believe her, he said. I really did. I know, I replied. And that doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. We sat there in silence, the weight of betrayal pressing down on us both. Finally he stood. I need to talk to her, he said. His voice was steady now, but something had changed, hardened, clarified. I nodded. I'll be here. He went upstairs. I stayed below, listening. Not to words, but to tone. Raised voices. Then silence. Long, heavy silence. When she came down later, her face was a mask of fury and wounded pride. You went through my things, she hissed. Yes, I said calmly. I did. How dare you? How dare you lie to my son? I replied. The word "my" slipped out before I could stop it, and once it did, it felt like truth reclaiming its place. She laughed then, a cold, brittle sound. You always did think he was yours. He is, I said, because I stayed. Her eyes narrowed. You stole my life. No, I said quietly. You abandoned it. The next morning, she left. No goodbye, no apology, just a slammed door and the echo of footsteps retreating into the past where they belonged. Daniel held me as I cried this time, not from fear, but from release. I thought that was the end. I was wrong. Because the real twist, the one that would shake everything we thought we knew, had not yet revealed itself. Not even close. 3 weeks passed. 3 quiet, deceptively gentle weeks where life tried to pretend it had returned to normal. Daniel called every day at first, then every other day, his voice steady but careful, like a man walking over ground he no longer trusted. I told him I was fine. I told him not to worry. Old habits die hard, especially the ones that make you strong for everyone else. But the truth was, something inside me had shifted. I slept poorly. I startled at small sounds. I kept expecting another knock on the door, another confrontation, another demand wrapped in the language of family. 40 years of suppressed fear doesn't disappear just because the immediate threat walks away. Then the letter arrived. It was thick, official, the kind of envelope that makes your stomach tighten before you even open it. My name was typed neatly across the front. Inside was a notice from a law firm I didn't recognize. My sister's name was at the top. I sat down before I read another word, my legs suddenly unreliable again, just like that first night long ago. The letter was polite, clinical. It informed me that my sister had initiated legal proceedings to establish formal parental recognition. Retroactively, she was contesting custodial misrepresentation and seeking acknowledgement as Daniel's legal mother, citing abandonment due to medical and psychological distress. I read it twice, then a third time. My hands began to shake, not with fear, but with disbelief so profound it felt almost unreal. After everything, after 40 years of silence, after lies and manipulation and false tears, she wasn't done. I called Daniel immediately. He was silent as I read the letter aloud. Too silent. She filed this yesterday, he said finally. She told me last night. You didn't tell me, he didn't say. But it hung there anyway. She says you turned me against her, he continued quietly. That you poisoned me. The words hurt more than I expected. Not because I believed he meant them, but because I had always known, somewhere deep down, that one day I might be accused of exactly that. I never spoke badly about her, I said. Not once. You know that. I do, he replied. But she's convincing. She cries. She says she lost everything. And what about what you lost? I asked gently. What about the years she chose not to be here? There was a pause, long, heavy. I'm meeting with a lawyer, he said. I need to understand what this means. After we hung up, I sat very still. For the first time in my life, I wondered if love might not be enough. The legal process was slow, grinding, and humiliating. Old records were dragged out, birth certificates, school forms, medical histories with my signature on them, decade after decade. I was described in careful, neutral language as the maternal aunt. 40 years of motherhood reduced to a footnote. My sister painted herself as a victim of circumstance, of trauma, of illness, of me. She claimed I had refused reconciliation, that I had positioned myself as the sole maternal figure, that I had benefited emotionally from raising her child. I wanted to scream, but the worst part wasn't the paperwork. It was watching Daniel struggle. He stopped calling as often. When he did, his voice was tight, conflicted. He spoke about fairness, about compassion, about how complicated things were. I recognized the words. I had taught him those values, and now they were being used to pry him away from me. One evening he came to see me in person. He sat at the kitchen table, the same one where this all began, and stared at his hands. She wants shared acknowledgement, he said. Not custody, just recognition, on paper. And what happens after that? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly exhausted in a way that went deeper than age. Daniel, I said, I need to tell you something I never planned to. He looked up. There was a night, I began, when you were 3. You had a fever that wouldn't break. I sat on the bathroom floor holding you, afraid you'd slip away if I let go. I remember thinking, if you live, I'll never ask for anything else. Not happiness, not recognition, just this. Just you. His eyes filled with tears. I never adopted you legally, I continued. Your mother refused to sign the papers. She said she might come back one day. That was the moment everything changed. What? He whispered. I stayed anyway, I said, knowing she'd left a door open, knowing she might return. I stayed. He covered his face with his hands. When he looked up again, something had broken, and something else had solidified. She planned this, he said slowly. All of it. Yes, I replied. She always does. The court date approached. And then, another twist. I received a call from a woman whose voice I didn't recognize. She introduced herself quietly, carefully. I'm a social worker, she said. I was assigned to a case involving your sister, decades ago. My breath caught. She never told you, the woman continued. But when she left your nephew with you, she had already been investigated. For neglect, for abandonment. There were prior incidents. I closed my eyes. She was warned, the woman said. If she took him back, she would lose all parental rights permanently. The silence that followed felt sacred, devastating, clarifying. That night, Daniel and I sat together again. I told him everything, all of it. He listened without interrupting, without defending, without doubting. When I finished, he stood, walked over to me, and knelt in front of my chair, his hands gripping mine. She didn't come back for me, he said. She came back for absolution and paperwork. I nodded. The next morning, he called his lawyer, and this time, he told them the whole truth. The court case ended before it truly began. Her petition was dismissed, quietly, firmly. She never contacted us again. Years have passed since then. I am older now, slower. My hands shake more. But when I sit on my porch in the evenings, listening to the wind move through the trees, I feel something I never expected to feel again. Peace. Daniel still calls every Sunday. He still signs his cards the same way. Love, your son. And now, finally, I believe that no matter who tries to rewrite the past, love that stays will always outweigh blood that walks away. Time does something strange when you get old. It doesn't rush anymore. It stretches. Days feel long, but years slip by like they were never properly held. After the court case ended, people assumed the story was over, that justice had been served, that wounds had healed neatly, that everyone moved on. But real life doesn't close its chapters so cleanly. It leaves dog-eared pages, margins full of unsaid things. My sister vanished again, this time for good. No calls, no letters, no dramatic final words. Just absence, her favorite language. For a while I caught myself listening for her, half expecting another disruption. Even betrayal, it seems, can become familiar if you live with it long enough. Daniel came back to himself slowly. At first, there was anger. Not loud anger, quiet, internal, the kind that settles behind the eyes and makes a person distant. He questioned everything, every memory, every story she had told him, even some of mine, though he never said it outright. I didn't blame him. When your foundation shakes, you inspect every brick. I feel stupid, he admitted one night over the phone, for almost believing her. You weren't stupid, I said. You were hopeful. There's a difference. Hope can bruise you badly, but it's never something to be ashamed of. The children, his children, were spared most of it. He and his wife decided early not to let the poison drip down another generation. To them, I was simply grandma, the one who baked too much, told stories too slowly, and always slipped them a little extra money for emergencies. They never asked about the woman who gave birth to their father, and I never volunteered the information. As the years passed, my body betrayed me in small, ordinary ways. A hip that protested stairs, hands that dropped things unexpectedly. Doctor's appointments became more frequent, conversations more repetitive. Aging is not dramatic. It's a series of quiet negotiations with your own limitations. Daniel noticed everything, of course. He insisted on installing handrails, on calling every Sunday without fail, on visiting more often, even when work was busy. Sometimes he hovered too much, the way anxious children do with aging parents. And sometimes I let him, because after a lifetime of giving, it felt strangely comforting to be looked after. One winter evening, when the cold settled deep into my bones, he came over with a folder. I need to talk to you about something, he said. I smiled weakly. That's usually how bad news starts. He shook his head. Not bad, just overdue. Inside the folder were legal papers, adoption papers. I know it's late, he said quickly. I know it doesn't change anything, but I want it on record, officially, legally. My throat tightened. Daniel, I don't want history rewritten again, he continued. Not by anyone, not ever. I couldn't speak. Tears blurred the words on the page, my name listed as his legal mother, finally, undeniably. 40 years late, but perfectly timed all the same. We signed the papers together. I slept better that night than I had in decades. A year later, I received news of my sister's death. It came through a distant cousin, passed along like an afterthought. She had died alone in a small apartment 2 states away. No spouse, no children at her bedside, no dramatic reconciliation, just an ending as quiet as her disappearances. I sat with the news longer than I expected. I didn't cry. What I felt was something more complicated, a soft, aching sadness for the girl she once was, the choices she made, the love she never learned how to keep. I wondered if she thought of us at the end, if she regretted anything, or if regret had always been too heavy for her to carry. Daniel asked me if I wanted to attend the funeral. No, I said gently. I've already grieved her, long ago. What surprised me most was what came next. Weeks later, another letter arrived, another legal envelope. My sister had left something behind. Not money, not property, a box. It was delivered to my door on a rainy afternoon, the cardboard softened by moisture, the tape peeling. Inside were old photographs, letters I had never received, and one small object wrapped carefully in cloth. The blue blanket, the one she'd left Daniel in. Tucked beneath it was a note, written in shaky handwriting. I knew you'd be better than me. I hated you for it. Thank you anyway. That was all. I held the blanket to my chest and cried then, not from anger, not from betrayal, but from release. Some stories don't need forgiveness to end. They just need acknowledgement. Now, I sit in my favorite chair most evenings, watching the light change through the window. The house is quieter again, but not empty. It's filled with echoes that no longer hurt. Daniel still calls every Sunday. Sometimes we talk about nothing at all. Sometimes he asks me to tell the story again. About the night the wind howled, about the baby on the porch, about the life neither of us planned but chose anyway. And when he thanks me, when his voice softens the way it did when he was small, I always tell him the same thing. You were never a burden. You were the reason. Because in the end, here is the truth I learned too late, but hold on to fiercely now. Blood may begin a story, but it doesn't finish it. Staying does. Choosing does. Love does. And no one, not time, not lies, not even betrayal, can take that away. I thought that would be the end of the story. I truly did. A neat closing of a wound that had been open most of my life. But old age has a way of giving you one last lesson, whether you ask for it or not. The year after my sister's death was the quietest year I have ever lived. Not lonely, quiet in the way a lake becomes still after a long storm. I moved slower. I spoke less. I listened more. Every sound felt sharper, more precious. The ticking clock. The kettle's whistle. My own breath in the early morning when the world hadn't woken up yet. That was when the memories came. Not the painful ones, but the small, tender fragments I hadn't noticed while living them. Daniel's first laugh, sharp and sudden, startling both of us. The way he used to press his forehead against mine when he was nervous. The night he stayed up late waiting for me to come home from the hospital after a scare, pretending he wasn't afraid. I realized something then that stopped me cold. I had spent 40 years afraid that one day someone would come and take him from me, and I had spent far less time appreciating that no one ever truly could. My health declined quietly without drama. The doctor used words like manageable and monitoring, but I could hear what he wasn't saying. I put my affairs in order, slowly, deliberately. I labeled old photographs. I wrote letters to the grandchildren for birthdays I might not see. I packed away things that no longer belonged to the future. One afternoon, Daniel found me folding the blue blanket. "I thought you put that away," he said gently. "I did," I replied. "But I wanted to feel it again." He sat beside me, careful not to rush me. He had learned patience from me, just as I had learned endurance from him. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Raising me?" I didn't answer right away. Not because the answer was hard, but because it deserved honesty, not reflex. "There were days," I said slowly, "when I was tired beyond words. Days when I wondered what my life would have been if I'd said no. If I'd handed you back the moment I could." He nodded, accepting that truth. "But regret?" I continued. "No, never that. You gave my life shape, purpose. You gave me a reason to stay when I might have drifted away." His eyes shone, and for the first time I saw him struggling not as a son, but as a man preparing to lose his mother. The final twist came quietly, almost shyly, the way truth sometimes does. Months later, Daniel brought me a document from the court. one last form that had surfaced after my sister's estate was closed. It wasn't a claim. It wasn't a demand. It was a relinquishment. Dated 40 years ago. Signed by my sister. Never filed. She had given up her parental rights the same year she left Daniel on my porch, but had never submitted the paperwork. Not because she planned to come back, because she couldn't bring herself to admit, even on paper, that she was walking away. We sat there together, the truth finally complete, no loose ends left to haunt us. She knew, Daniel said quietly, all along. Yes, I replied. She knew you were safe, and she let that be enough. That knowledge didn't erase her choices, but it softened the sharpest edges of them. It allowed the story to settle into something human instead of monstrous. When my time finally came, it wasn't dramatic either. I was in my own bed. My window was open. The wind moved the curtains just enough to remind me of that first night. The storm, the doorstep, the beginning of everything. Daniel was there, holding my hand, just like I had held his. You stayed, he whispered, his voice breaking. You always stayed. I smiled, because even then, I knew the truth. So did he. Love isn't proven by beginnings. It's proven by endurance, by who shows up when it's hard, by who stays when no one is watching. I raised my sister's child as my own, and in the end, he raised me too. That is how the story truly ends, not with betrayal, not with blood, not with claims of ownership, but with something far rarer and stronger. A life chosen, a bond earned, and a love that never once walked away. I don't know how much time passed after that. When you reach the very end, time loosens its grip on you. It stops marching and starts circling, revisiting moments you thought were long gone, holding them up to the light one last time. What I do know is this: I was not afraid. That surprised me most of all. I had spent so many years afraid of losing Daniel, losing my place, losing the fragile truth I had built my life around, that I assumed fear would be the last thing to leave me. But as my body weakened, something else grew stronger: certainty. A deep, steady knowing that nothing important was unresolved anymore. Daniel moved into the house during those final months. Not officially, he still called it staying over, but we both knew what it meant. He slept in the guest room, the same one his biological mother had once occupied so briefly, and I found a strange, quiet symmetry in that. Life closing its circle without asking permission. Every morning he helped me sit up, brought me tea, opened the curtains just enough to let the light spill in. We talked about ordinary things: the weather, the neighbor's dog, what he'd make for dinner. Ordinary talk is a gift at the end. It keeps you anchored to the living. Sometimes he asked me questions about my childhood, about his early years, about things I'd never thought were important enough to say out loud. I answered slowly, choosing my words carefully, not because I was afraid of saying the wrong thing, but because I wanted him to carry the right things forward. One afternoon, when the house was quiet and the light slanted low and golden across the floor, he asked the question I knew had been waiting between us for decades. "Why did you keep me?" he asked. "That first night, you could have called someone, anyone." I looked at him, really looked at him, the man he had become, the life that had unfolded from a single, unplanned choice. "You looked at me like you already trusted me," I said, "and I couldn't imagine betraying that." He swallowed hard. "I wasn't brave," I added. "I was terrified. But sometimes love isn't bravery. Sometimes it's just not turning away." He nodded, tears slipping free now, unashamed. He had learned that from me, too. The grandchildren came to visit in small doses. I didn't have the energy for long afternoons anymore, but I loved listening to their voices echo through the house, bright and unburdened. They sat on the edge of my bed and told me stories about school, about friends, about things that felt wonderfully unimportant. I watched Daniel watch them, and I saw the lineage clearly then. Not of blood, but of presence. I had done that. One evening, when my breathing grew shallow and the world felt softer around the edges, Daniel sat beside me and brushed my hair the way I used to brush his when he was small. His hands trembled, mine no longer could. "Promise me something," he said quietly. I smiled. "You were always the one asking for promises." "Promise me you know," he said, his voice cracking, "that you were enough, that you didn't just fill a gap, you were the foundation." I gathered what strength I had left and squeezed his hand. "I was never trying to replace anyone," I said. "I was just trying to love you well." That night, as sleep crept in and out like a tide, I thought about my sister one last time. Not with anger, not even with sadness, just clarity. She had given birth to a child. I had raised a human being. Those are not the same thing. In the quiet moments between breaths, I understood something else too. Something I wish I'd known earlier. She never really came back for him. She came back to see if love could be reclaimed without being earned. And she learned, too late, that it cannot. When the end finally came, it was gentle. Daniel was holding my hand, his thumb moving in slow circles the way I used to soothe him. The wind moved through the open window, brushing the curtains softly, familiarly. For a moment, I was back on that porch, barefoot, frightened, holding a future I hadn't asked for. But this time, I wasn't alone. I felt peace settle over me like a warm blanket. And then I let go. If anyone ever tells this story after I'm gone, I hope they don't frame it as a tragedy. It wasn't. It was a life shaped by choice, not obligation. By staying, not claiming. I raised my sister's child as my own, and when she came back for him after 40 years, she learned what I had known all along. You cannot take back a life you didn't show up for. You cannot undo absence with words. And you cannot compete with love that stayed through every ordinary, unremarkable day. In the end, I was not the woman who lost a child. I was the woman who gained a son. And that, quietly, irrevocably, was everything. After I was gone, the house did what houses always do. It waited. Daniel told me later that for weeks he couldn't bring himself to change anything. My cardigan stayed folded over the chair. My cup stayed on the nightstand. The blue blanket rested where I had left it, as if it were still warm. Grief, he learned, is not loud at first. It is quiet and practical. It asks you to decide what to do with objects that still feel like people. He moved through the room slowly, listening to the echoes. He said the house felt full of instructions, small ones I'd left behind without meaning to, where the spare keys were hidden, which cupboard stuck if you didn't lift it just right, how the back step dipped and needed care in winter. He realized then that love doesn't vanish when a body does. It turns into guidance. It becomes a map. On Sundays, he kept the habit. He sat at the kitchen table and talked out loud as if I were there. Sometimes he told me about work, sometimes about the children. Sometimes he said nothing at all and just let the quiet answer him. He said it felt less like pretending and more like continuing a conversation that had always been meant to last. When he finally sorted through my papers, he found the letter I'd written but never sealed. The one addressed to him, written in my careful hand on plain stationery. He recognized the opening line immediately because I'd used it his whole life. My dear boy. In it, I told him what I hadn't always known how to say when my voice still worked easily. That raising him hadn't been a detour from my life. It had been the road. That every sacrifice people imagine was a loss had been repaid 1,000 times over in ordinary miracles, shared meals, shared worries, shared laughter that came out of nowhere and stayed longer than expected. I told him that if anyone ever tried again to make him choose, between blood and bond, between origin and love, he didn't owe the question an answer. Some choices are insults dressed up as fairness. He was allowed to walk away from them. At the end of the letter, I wrote the truth I'd learned too late, but lived by anyway. You don't belong to the people who claim you. You belong to the people who care for you when it's inconvenient. Daniel cried when he read that part. Not because it was sad, but because it named something he'd always felt and never known how to defend. Months later, when the seasons turned and the house felt too large for one man and his memories, he made a decision. He didn't sell it. He opened it. The grandchildren came first, filling the rooms with noise and movement again. Then neighbors. Then friends. The spare room became a place for people who needed time. Students between apartments, relatives between plans, anyone who arrived unsure and left steadier. The house learned a new purpose, one that felt familiar in its bones. Daniel said he did it because that was how the house had been taught to be. Sometimes, someone would ask him about his mother. The story had a way of slipping out over cups of coffee, over long evenings when honesty felt safe. He never rushed it. He never softened it. He told it the way it was, without bitterness, without heroics. He spoke about a woman who stayed, about a woman who chose him every day without paperwork, without praise, without guarantees. About a woman who understood that love isn't proven in grand moments, but in the willingness to be present on the dull, difficult ones. And sometimes, when people asked about the other woman, the one who came back after 40 years, he would pause. She was part of the story, he'd say carefully, but not the center of it. That, more than anything, felt like justice. Years passed. The grandchildren grew taller. The world changed its shape again and again. But the story didn't lose its meaning. If anything, it grew clearer with time. Because here is what I know now, from wherever love goes when it has finished its work. No one can come back and claim a life they did not tend. No signature can replace presence. No shared blood can outweigh shared days. I did not raise my sister's child because I was noble. I raised him because love asked me to, and I said yes. And when she came back for him after 40 years, she discovered the truth we all learn eventually. Sometimes gently, sometimes too late. You cannot retrieve what you never carried. You cannot harvest where you did not plant. And you cannot undo absence with intention alone. My life did not end with betrayal. It did not end with fear. It ended with a son who knew who his mother was, not by name, not by law, but by memory and by heart. And that is not a sad ending. That is a complete one. If there is anything more to tell, it is this. The part people rarely speak about, because it doesn't sound dramatic enough for the world. Love does not end when a story ends. It lingers. Daniel felt it most in the smallest moments. When he reached for the phone on a Sunday before remembering there was no call to make. When he caught himself saving a piece of advice to tell me later. When he stood in the grocery aisle staring at a brand of tea he didn't even like, but bought anyway because it felt wrong to leave it behind. Grief didn't come crashing in like a storm. It arrived like a tide, slow and steady, pulling at his ankles when he least expected it. But beneath it, there was something else. Gratitude. A quiet, grounding sense that whatever pain existed now was not unfinished business. It was the natural cost of having been deeply loved. Years later, when the grandchildren were old enough to ask real questions, Daniel told them the story himself. Not all at once, not with bitterness. He told it the way you tell the truth when you've made peace with it. He told them about a woman who became a mother without planning to. About a baby left on a porch during a storm. About how love sometimes arrives disguised as responsibility, and how the bravest thing you can do is open the door instead of closing it. They asked about the other woman, of course, the one who came back. Daniel never spoke her name with anger. He didn't erase her, and he didn't elevate her either. He told them she existed, that she made choices, and that choices have consequences no matter how much time passes. "What happened to her?" one of the children asked once. "She lived with the life she chose," he said simply. "Just like we all do." That answer stayed with them. As for the blue blanket, it became something of a legend in the family. It was folded carefully and placed in a cedar chest, brought out only on special occasions, not as a symbol of abandonment, but as proof of beginning. Proof that even the most painful starts can lead somewhere gentle. On the anniversary of my passing, Daniel planted a tree in the backyard. Not a grand one. Nothing ornamental. Just something sturdy. Something that would grow slowly and quietly, its roots deep, its branches wide enough to offer shade one day to someone who might need it. He stood there with his children, dirt on his hands, and felt something settle inside him. This is how love continues, he realized. Not through inheritance or bloodlines or claims made too late, but through repetition, through showing up, through choosing the same good thing again and again, even when no one is keeping score. Sometimes, when the wind moves through the leaves just right, he swears he can feel me there. Not watching, not hovering, just present in the way a home is present even after you've left it. And that is how I want this story to end. Not with the woman who came back after 40 years, though she believed she was the center of it. She wasn't. The story was never about who left. It was about who stayed. It was about a choice made in fear that turned into a lifetime of love. About a child who grew up knowing he was wanted, not because he was claimed, but because he was cherished. About a woman who never asked to be a hero and never tried to be one. I raised my sister's child as my own. And when she came back for him after 40 years, she learned what the rest of us eventually must. Love is not something you can reclaim once you've abandoned it. It is something you either tend or you lose. I did not lose. I gained a son, a family, a life that mattered. And if there is any legacy worth leaving behind, it is this simple truth, spoken softly and lived fully. The people who raise us are not always the ones who give us life. They are the ones who stay long enough to become it. Every story like this leaves behind a question people don't always ask out loud. Was it worth it? The sacrifice, the waiting, the risk of being left behind in the end. And the answer is simple. Even if life wasn't. Yes. Not because it was easy, not because it was fair, but because love that is chosen, day after day, year after year, creates a truth that no one can undo, not even time. Your story already has a proper ending. It closes with peace, not revenge, with certainty, not bitterness, with a son who knew exactly who his mother was. If you ever wanted an extra soft epilogue, a final paragraph meant to fade out like the last shot of a film, I can write that. If you want it left exactly as it is, you've already ended it in the strongest possible way. Nothing essential is missing. The circle is